I am so glad to be here with EdHeroes again this year. And so I would like to give you a good grounding on some important information. Maybe you've heard it, maybe not. But then we're going to go in very different directions. So my own background is that I grew up thinking I can never learn math. So I wanted to try to learn another language. And I did. I went to the Defense Language Institute and I learned Russian, of all great languages. But the thing is, I happened to study at one of the best language learning institutions in the world. And I learned not only how to learn a language, but also I learned how we learn. So, of course, I also learned while working out on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea. So that was an adventure in and of itself. But it's been уже 40 лет с тех пор, как я говорила по-русски. Мне стыдно, я забыла очень много. But in any case, I learned how we learn, and when I learned this, I applied this to learning in math and science, and guess what? It works. You can, I am now, believe it or not, a distinguished professor of engineering, and I love math and science, despite the fact that during my earliest years, I thought I could never do it. And this all boils down to some interesting phenomena about how we do really learn. Turns out if you know just a few simple ideas about learning, you can learn more effectively. And one simple idea simply relates to the idea that we have this fundamental building block in our brain called the neuron. There's 86 billion neurons in the brain, so you can never run out of learning space, so to speak. But to better understand a neuron, we're going to use a space alien. And a space alien, in this case, it has like 3 legs, as you can see. Those are analogous to what are called dendrites on real neurons. And then we have something like these little toes on the neurons, on those dendrites. See those little green toes? Those are analogous to what are called dendritic spines on real neurons. And then we've got this thing like an arm that reaches out, and that's called an axon. And what neurons like to do is they reach out with that axon and they tickle the toes of an adjoining neuron. What this really means is that they are sending signals. Those signals are largely electric, so they travel down the axon, they jump that little gap with neurotransmitters and then travel on to the next neuron. And when you're learning something, when you're learning anything, whether it's how to take a derivative in math, how to conjugate a verb in a foreign language, do a dance step, kick a soccer ball, whatever you're learning, you are creating links in long-term memory. To strengthen those links, you practice, but practice of a special kind, not rereading, not underlining and highlighting, but retrieving, remembering that information in your own mind. If you don't retrieve and practice with that information, your little synaptic janitors can sweep those dendritic spines away, and you forget what you've learned. So ultimately, what we want is that students will create these deep, rich, thick neural connections that are easy to pull to mind when they've learned something. As it turns out, you cannot think critically about what AI is giving you unless you know something inside yourself. If I say to you, 12 times 12 is 236, there should be something inside you that says, no, it's not. And that something is your own internal knowledge of those patterns of multiplication. Now, in Finland, for example, there's a problem because nursing students, if they punch in the wrong number, they simply don't have that innate feeling for mathematics, for numbers, because they haven't internalized the multiplication tables. So if they happen to punch in 10 times 10 and they get 1,000, there's nothing in them that says 1,000 is really wrong. And they can miscalculate and actually hurt patients by giving them drug dosages that are completely inappropriate. So in this day and age of AI, kind of you wouldn't expect it, but it's a time when we need to know more inside our own brain if we are to think critically about AI and what's going on with AI. So now I had mentioned that we make these links in long-term memory if we learn something. But I didn't mention there's two ways to put those links in long-term memory. The first way is like declarative learning. So you take information into working memory. That's like this temporary storage place. You think about it, you put it through your hippocampus into weak links in long-term memory. But the other way you learn is you take information in through that automatic system, the basal ganglia, and this is the system where you learn habits. So for example, maybe you went home to your house, maybe you rode a bicycle or drove to your new place where you're living, your new apartment. And you do it the first time and you're like, which way do I turn? And then you do it over and over again over many days. And then one day you find you got home and you don't even know how you got home. You didn't even have to think about it. That was this automatic basal ganglia way of learning things. That way of learning takes the burden off of thinking. And it's partly just your mind kind of saying, wait a minute, I'm doing this over and over again. Now, let's just make it something you could do automatically without thinking about it. And it makes things easier. We need both kinds of links to be able to function effectively. Here's the trick, though. Let's look at this in a little bit of a simpler way. If you think of that declarative hippocampal system as that blue box, and the orange box is that automatic system, then if you are thinking consciously about that, mathematics problem, you're step by step, you're going through that problem, you're conscious of what you're doing, you figure it out. This is what, if you know the book Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, this is the slow system. The fast system is that basal ganglia system. Now, this is what the basal ganglia can do. It learns, but in a very different way. You're not conscious of it. But let's say you're trying to learn how to hit a baseball. In some sense, you say to your basal ganglia, okay, hit the baseball. And you hit it, and then you see the result of what, you hit the ball. Did it go in the right way? But you have no idea how your brain is learning how to hit that ball. You hit it again and again. You hit it, you see the outcome. You hit it, you see the outcome. Gradually, you learn how to hit the baseball, but you have no idea how you're learning it. What is in this magical, unconscious way of learning? It is a deep neural network. All of those little circles represent neurons. And so there's a neuron, and then the line represents like the axon, the dendritic spine, and the dendrite leading to the next neuron. I call this a deep neural net, or this is called a deep neural net because it has many layers of neurons. And these layers are what do the subconscious or unconscious learning required for learning skills like hitting the baseball, but also learning things like how to speak your native language. This system isn't just for rote memorization and simplistic learning. If I say in English, I goed to the store, there's something inside me that says that is wrong. I should be saying I went to the store. And it's because I learned the patterns through that basal ganglia system, and I know how to speak English, even if I don't know why I say certain things the way I do. Now, this system is also important even for learning mathematics. If a child memorizes the multiplication tables, they really know it by heart, and they know it inside out, they begin to recognize the number, the relationship between the patterns of numbers. So if I say 12 times 12 is, 290, you know that's a wrong pattern. That doesn't fit. So when we're learning, we're using that basal ganglia system. And this, that's part of how we learn. We hit the baseball, we hit it again, we hit it again. We strengthen some connections, we weaken others. We're basically weighting those connections between the neurons. That set of weights is called the value function. And that set of weights, weighting like this, and the connections is really similar to how large language models themselves, like ChatGPT, have actually been how they evolved. In fact, when workers in artificial intelligence, when they get stuck, they go to neuroscientists and say, how does the brain actually do this? Get some ideas, they go back, they try it out. And then actually when neuroscientists would get stuck, they'd go to AI experts and say, can you model this aspect of neural functioning? So neuroscience and AI, they've been growing hand in hand through the summers and the winters of AI development. So it's really quite important to realize we've got these two very, very different ways of learning, and one of them is very much like how AI learns. So this non-conscious basal ganglia system is strongest in children. That's why they can learn new languages so easily and without an accent. As children grow into adolescence, that more hippocampal-oriented system comes on and gets stronger. And that is, both systems are important. Interestingly, in those with dyslexia, it seems that this basal ganglia system isn't quite functioning as strongly. So they can, it's like a person who has like there's a famous kickboxer who had damaged his right knee. So he developed a technique where he would put his left leg forward, and he used his right leg as a kind of a pivot, and he got so much extra practice with that left leg that he ended up winning the world championship a number of times. And it's because there was some damage to the one system that helped him hyper develop the other. This can happen with neurodiverse students. So those with dyslexia, they can have some dysfunction in that basal ganglia. That can cause that more declarative system to become really strong and powerful. For some reason, this can really enhance the ability to visualize, and no one is really quite sure why that takes place. Contrarily, in those with autism who are on the spectrum, they can have very powerful pattern recognition systems due to a hyper developed basal ganglia. But in any case, in those humans who have their hippocampus disabled, which happens with Alzheimer's, your hippocampus gradually becomes destroyed, and they can hallucinate and confabulate. And this is kind of what we see in large language models. They have this non-conscious, we hope, way of processing things. And they're like the wonderful little assistant that can occasionally be sort of psychopathic. They don't have that conscious, overlooking, declarative system to keep an eye on them. But if you think about it, let's look at these two different systems. We've got the orange basal ganglia experiential way of learning, and then that blue sort of explanatory way of learning. And that relates to how teaching can occur. We can have lecture, which is through that explanatory basal ganglia system. And then we can have that active student-centered way of learning. And what's happened in Western education only is, guess what? They have said lecture is really bad because it should only happen during, you should only have students learning actively themselves. What have we just done? We have cut off Western reform constructivist student-centered educational approaches, actually advocate completely denying one of the most powerful ways that adults can learn effectively, and that's through that hippocampal system. In fact, what is most powerfully effective is a mixture of some lecture, some active learning. What should the appropriate percentage be of each? Well, it depends on how old the student is, what's their prior knowledge, all sorts of different things. But this mixture is called direct instruction. And direct instruction has a really good history behind it. In fact, the largest educational study ever conducted in history was Project Follow Through. Cost $100 million. It involved tens of thousands of teachers, hundreds of thousands of students for 10 years. They studied 9 different educational approaches, including direct instruction, that sort of alternation. Guess what? Direct instruction was so much better than everything else that education study was never published. Why? Because look, all the other 8 looked bad. They were in no way even near direct instruction's efficacy. In fact, some ways of learning, believe it or not, actually make it worse for kids. They learn less effectively. So it's really quite amazing that, we can actually teach using methodologies that make it worse for kids. So if I ask you, like, what's the most powerful technique for students to learn effectively? Reading, highlighting, retrieval practice, remembering, or creating a concept map. Most people trained in Western reform educational methods will say it's a concept map. That's the best. But guess what? The actual best way to keep you in suspense is retrieval practice. Pulling that information from your own mind. You get weak links when you learn something, but each time you remember it, pull it to mind, you are actually strengthening those links. And this has been shown in hundreds and hundreds of studies. So it is, like using simple flashcards can be powerfully effective. In fact, I know someone who graduated #1 in his medical school classes, hardly ever going to the classes. He would simply read the textbooks, create flashcards, not notes. He would create flashcards, watch videos, create flashcards, graduated #1 in his medical school class. There's a really important study to be aware of. And what this found was if you compare all the different disciplines, education by far has the lowest replication rate. In fact, what is replication? It means that of all the studies that are done, education, 0.13% of studies that are published are actually checked and repeated by any independent research group. That means you have all these publications and the tiniest little percentage is ever checked. This is why education, especially Western education, could have all these bogus results. It's a fad this year, a fad next year, a fad whatever. Fads all over the place and very, very little real solid replication of these studies. There's something called the Flynn effect. This was observed by an American who moved to New Zealand. He found from the 1930s to the 70s, IQ scores rose. But guess what? Does that really mean they were getting smarter? It turns out it kind of does mean that. Researchers found that exposure to good education systems actually seems to improve cognition. But since the 1970s, IQ scores have been going down, and that's only in Western countries that have been influenced by constructivist, student-centered approaches. And many of these approaches are it's amazing, but they will say things like, we are teaching students how to learn. No, they're not. Actually, they don't use any insights from neuroscience about learning. They'll say, we're teaching critical thinking. Really? Actually, I will not name a school, but once I was putting forth a course, and when you develop a new course, you can actually put on it whether it's a critical thinking course. So, of course, I asked, well, what's the definition of critical thinking so I know whether it applies to my course? They had no definition of critical thinking. It was just, if I felt like it was critical thinking, that was good enough. This is a lot of what is happening with critical thinking. There's something called the 85% rule for optimal learning. And what this means is we need to kind of, as we're learning, get things right, like 85% of the time, or we can lose motivation. It's really hard to learn. Now, the thing is, though, in neural space, there are trillions of dimensions, ways of thinking. This means if we expect students to construct their own learning, they have to navigate through this space of trillions of possible ways to go. It's no wonder it took humans thousands of years to even discover the concept of the zero, much less negative numbers, much less multiplication vectors, and so forth. And we expect students to construct their own knowledge? This is really, it helps for students to be guided really close so they can grab that knowledge, and put it together. But you have to carefully guide them there. One of my fields of expertise is in pathological altruism. This is, I published a edited volume that was reviewed in the New York Times, a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and surprisingly, this even got a great review in the New York Times, which is pretty unheard of for a edited academic volume. But this idea is, in essence, the idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We can have just like this is an optical illusion. You look at these and you're convinced that these two tables have different sizes on the top. But if you look here, you can see they actually have the same size. It's an optical illusion. Similarly, we can have illusions of helping. And so, let's take New Zealand and how it is done over the last 30 years or so, 20, 30 years. If you look at their school leavers examination, sort of a kind of how well are students doing when they're leaving school, you would think, wow, for the last 20 years or so, they've been doing great. They're getting better and better. Actually, no. They've been reducing step by step the percentage of students, how easy it is to pass the test has become easier and easier, which is why more students seem to be doing better. If you compare what's happening nationally, internationally, PISA scores, New Zealand has been going down, down, down. They used to be at the top of the industrialized world with their education system. Now they are at the bottom. A big part of this involves that idea of student-centered, child-centered learning. We think, oh, it's so nice, it's so simple. Children construct their own knowledge, and it's really, really a wonderful thing. No, actually, kids really don't know things. That's why they need good teaching. It helps them to grow in their learning. Many of my colleagues at schools of engineering and throughout the U.S. in technical schools, medical schools, and so forth, by and large, my colleagues there are from countries that still value at least a modicum of rote learning. Getting knowledge inside your own head is hard, but those countries still value this approach. So good learning, student-centered learning really is important, but good teaching really, really matters as well. And it shouldn't be discounted as it can unfortunately be done under Western educational approaches. And of course, good evidence about teaching and what's effective is really important as well. So with that, I would like to thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure to share.